Good morning. My name is Olivia Presentation, and I will be explaining to you the effects of cognitive writing skills on a high school student's brain. This research project was aimed to study the correlation between cognitive skills and to be able to do math in your head versus on paper. How I got my question. As some of you may or may not know, College Board has decided to switch the SAT to digital. College Board states that the SAT is a fully digital format aiming to improve the test experience and make it more accessible and flexible, while maintaining the same scoring scale and measuring the same skills as the paper and pencil version. As College Board is a very reliable source, when I found this, I wondered how reliable it was and if kids felt the same way, so I decided to do a little more digging. Then I found an article by the Princeton Review. The Princeton Review stated that the digital SAT adaptive format and reliance on technology, including the Blue Book app, are perceived as making the test more challenging for students, potentially leading to anxiety and disrupting their flow. This really caught my eye because both these sources are very reliable, and I wondered who could truly be correct. I then looked into the cognitive brain skills on testing. One source from the National Library of Medicine states, to tap your fingers, you do not have to trace out the form of the letters. They just make 3 relatively simple and uniform movements. In comparison, it takes a lot more brain power as well as crosstalk between brain areas to write than to type. This is showing that I have to write things out, that writing things out has a much greater impact on brains, cortex, and memory control that rather than typing or not writing at all. This is also proven by a recent brain imaging study that proves this idea. Why I got this question. I chose this question because of past experiences in my own life, dealing with taking the SAT and ACT and other forms of tests online and in paper, all of which resulted in me scoring higher taking the test on paper than online. I also feel very passionate about this type of study due to my dyslexia and different learning accommodations. This project is important to see if students will score differently on paper versus on paper or not right at all. This is good for teachers and creators of different tests and different SAT creators. My gap. The gap that I found in my research was that kids that test scores actually affected if they are not physically able to write on the test, meaning they were given a paper test but still not allowed to write on it, but only use Scantron. So this brings me to my research question. To what extent does writing on a high school math test affect a student's score at a small private high school on the east coast of Florida? My hypothesis states that there will be a significant increase on the test that encourages students to write, meaning there will be a large increase in grades when you are able to write on the test. Now, before I get into my research, I have some key terms. My first key term is cognitive brain function. Cognitive brain function encompasses the mental process that enables us to learn and make decisions, including attention, memory, language, and reasoning, and this is by the Cleveland Clinic. My second term is learning disabilities, which is a neurological condition that affects how a person learns to read, write, speak, or do math, despite having average or above average intelligence. This is characterized by specific difficulties in certain areas of learning and is not related to intellectual disability, and this definition is also by the Cleveland Clinic. Now on to my method and experiment. The method I chose was an experiment. My experiment was on a high school math test. The class had 70 kids that I was able to test on. Before I gave them their test, I also had them sign a consent paper per College Board, so they could be used in my AP project. Now let's get into the type of test that was given. Each student was given 2 tests exactly 2 weeks apart. Every test was the exact same, 10 questions. Each question was chosen carefully by myself and their Algebra 2 teacher. It was a multiple choice test with no fill in the blanks. Every question that was on this test could be done in their head without a calculator or writing it out. The first test that was given was exactly the same as the second one. The only difference was the first test, no students were allowed to write on the test. Other than that, the students were allowed to write their answers on the side. Students took around 10 to 15 minutes to finish the test, even though they had the full amount of time. At this time, I was observing how each student was doing the math. Some students, I could tell they were doing it in their head, while others were trying to write it out with their finger. As I stated, that the second test was the same exact as the first test, just only 2 weeks later. They were told they had to write at least one thing for each test, and they had to show all their work. So the first test and the second test, each student took around 10 to 15 minutes. And as I was observing these kids, they had a little more ease because they were able to write on it. At the bottom of the second test, they were asked survey questions. The first survey asked, did not being able to write on the test affect your cognitive skills and function when taking the test? And the second question asked, do you prefer doing math in your head or writing it out? I collected my data by scoring all the tests by hand, then putting them into a calculator and using statistic variability to find the mean, median, Q1, minimum, Q3, and maximum. As you can see, my results, the first test, there was a slight skew to the right, meaning most scores were lower on the test. The second test, it was a little more even, but most scores were around the mean. The results showed the context in which, the results showed that the first test, where no kids could write on it, the mean was 54%, which means the average score out of 70 kids was 54. On the second test, which had the same questions just 2 weeks later, but encouraged the students to write on it, had an average score of 59, which means out of the 70 kids, most kids scored a 59%. Even though there was an increase in scores by only 5%, and this is not a big gap, even though there was an increase in scores, it was only by 5%, so there was not a big enough gap between the tests. I did notice that there was a large range between each test. The first test showed that the lowest score was a 0, meaning not one question was correct. Out of the 70 students, not one person got anything correct. The highest score was a 90, meaning there was only one question wrong. On the second test, the lowest score was a 10, which means everyone at least got one question correct. The high score was 100, meaning some student or students got a perfect score. Then I compared each test and how many students got each question wrong. The results I found were 62% of students scored the exact same on both tests. 87% of those students got the same exact question wrong on both tests. This means 80% of each student had no effect on writing on the test, and their average was exactly the same. I then looked at my survey question results. This class was split into two answers. Half of them stated that they needed to write on the paper to help them memorize the material and not get lost in their head. And writing it out, even if it took longer, they think they scored higher. The other half stated that it was a waste of time to write it all out, and they just preferred doing it in their head since it was simple math. This showed that every kid had a different preference, whether they wanted to write it out or just do it in their head, so there was no skewed data here. After finding my results, I found my hypothesis was incorrect. Even though there was a small gap, being 5%, there on the writing test, there was not a strong enough gap in scoring for it to be statistically significant. Even though it was not statistically significant, I was able to fill my gap. I filled my gap by testing students with results stating that there was no significant difference between letting students write on a math test, showing that they are just as capable of doing it in their head as well as writing it out. Some key findings that I found were almost every kid scored the exact same with very few outliers, and that writing does not have an effect on a student's Algebra 2 math test score. Some future results that can be done are gender, different disabilities, and on a bigger scale. To go more in depth with this, I decided to compare the male and female test results. I found that between the two tests, there was a 12% positive difference in males, meaning that 12% of the males got higher compared to the first test and the second test. On the other hand, there was only 3% difference between females, which was lower than the average mean between both males and females. This is important for future studies because someone could use this data to see if there's a difference in genders and writing on a high school math test. The second thing I went a little more in depth with was learning disabilities. After the second test, I asked each student to write their name on a piece of paper and write if they had a disability or not. The results I found were that 38% of students had a learning disability out of the 70 kids. 89% of those students got at least one more question correct on the test they were able to write on. This number is statistically significant, and having to speculate this, meaning that kids who had disabilities and were able to write on the test will most likely get a higher score and have a positive impact. This information can help. The last thing was different classes, meaning that you can you can test different classes, being a science class or a math class. Some of my limitations include not taking the test seriously. As I was observing, I noticed some students might have just bubbled and in random answers and then gone to sleep, meaning that their test was invalid. Another limitation I had were a high percent of students with learning disabilities, which could have skewed my data one way or another. My last limitation was the type of class. Since I didn't do honors or AP, I only did an academic class, which could have skewed my data. My data was very limited because I only did an academic class. Some of my delimitations include a bigger sample scale, meaning I was working with a very small private high school, and if I were to do a bigger public school, you could have had different data because there would have been more than 70 kids in the Algebra 2 class. And I did not expand my research to public school, and I only focused on the small school. Now, who does this apply to? On a larger scale, this applies to AP creators and SAT creators. The AP and SAT have decided to go fully digital, meaning students could not score high on a test if they are not able to write out much information down or highlight or circle information, which makes it easier to score better. Now, on a smaller scale, teachers and school districts may help teachers and school districts with limitations on what type of test to give each student and how to give the student and know different types of testing environments. Because each student learns differently, and everyone should have the option to write it either on paper or do it online in their head or write it out. And here are my sources. Thank you.
All right, Olivia, well done. Olivia, how did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation around your topic lead to your final research question and project goal?
So when I found out that SAT and ACT went digital, that kind of sparked my interest in doing online or in paper testing or like being able to write it out, because for me, I like to circle and highlight things, and I feel like that's how I get higher scores. So when I found this out, I kind of wanted to focus on that, but there was a lot of testing with digital and on digital versus paper testing. So I wanted to do like a little, go more in depth with it and see how much writing affected.
Yeah, Olivia, kind of as a follow-up to that, you touched on this a little bit, but what did the limitations of your method or data influence your understanding?
So my limitations were, since it was such a small class size and it was um, a academic class size, there was different IQs, and I didn't expand on that. So since it is an academic class, people might have not taken it as seriously as if it was an higher level class, because I feel like AP kids or even honors kids would have maybe taken it a little more seriously. So I feel like that was definitely a challenge for me.
Right. What was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply it to your future endeavors?
So I definitely learned patience with this, working with the kids. It was really difficult sometimes because I noticed some of the kids just didn't care, or they were talking during the test or things like that. So I feel like I really learned patience and how to come at people that were doing this and try to reverse that and make it more so everyone kind of was paying attention.